Alfonso Cahero, A Journey into Finance History, Chapter 42, Marshall Plan for European Recovery, Post-WWII, 1948. In the grim aftermath of World War II, Europe stood in ruins. The once proud cities lay decimated, reduced to rubble and ash. Streets that were once bustling with life now lay deserted, their silence a haunting reminder of the destruction that had been wrought upon them. The war had exacted a heavy toll, both in terms of lives lost and infrastructure destroyed. Millions of people had perished in the conflict, and those who survived were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. As the smoke cleared and the extent of the devastation became clear, Europe faced a daunting challenge: how to rebuild in the wake of such destruction. Entire cities had been razed to the ground, their once magnificent buildings reduced to piles of rubble. Infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and railways lay in ruins, making it difficult for people to travel or transport goods. And the economies of Europe were in shambles, with industries crippled and trade disrupted by years of conflict. But amidst the rubble and despair, there was a glimmer of hope. The end of the war brought with it the promise of a new beginning, a chance for Europe to rise from the ashes and rebuild stronger than ever before. The task would not be easy, but the people of Europe were determined to persevere, to rebuild their homes, their communities, and their lives. The turning point came in June 1947, when United States Secretary of State George Marshall delivered a speech at Harvard University that would change the course of history. In his address, Marshall laid out a bold plan to aid in the reconstruction of war-torn Europe. The plan, which would come to be known as the Marshall Plan, proposed providing financial assistance and support to help Europe rebuild its shattered economies. Marshall's speech was a rallying cry for the nations of Europe, urging them to come together in a spirit of cooperation and solidarity to rebuild their continent. He recognized that the challenges facing Europe could not be overcome by any one nation alone, and that only by working together could they hope to rebuild their shattered continent. The Marshall Plan offered a lifeline to the struggling nations of Europe, providing them with the resources they needed to rebuild and recover from the devastation of war. The Marshall Plan was more than just a simple aid package. It was a call to action for the nations of Europe to set aside their differences and work towards a common goal. Marshall understood that the fate of Europe was closely tied to the fate of the United States, and that a stable and prosperous Europe was essential to ensuring peace and security in the post-war world. The plan called for the establishment of a European recovery program, which would coordinate the distribution of aid and oversee the reconstruction efforts in Europe. It also called for the creation of a European payments union, which would help facilitate trade and investment between European nations. By working together, Marshall believed that the nations of Europe could overcome the challenges they faced and build a brighter future for themselves and their children. In the months following Marshall's speech, the nations of Europe began to lay the groundwork for the implementation of the Marshall Plan. Committees were formed, meetings were held, and plans were drawn up to determine how best to allocate the funds provided by the United States. It was a monumental task, requiring unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination between nations that had only recently been locked in bitter conflict. But despite the challenges, there was a sense of determination and optimism in the air. The people of Europe had been given a lifeline, and they were determined to make the most of it. As the machinery of reconstruction began to churn into action, the streets that had once been filled with rubble began to come alive once more. Shops reopened, factories resumed production, and people went about their daily lives with a newfound sense of hope and purpose. On April 3, 1948, the Marshall Plan officially went into effect, marking the beginning of a new era for Europe. Over the next 4 years, the United States would provide over $13 billion in aid to help rebuild the shattered economies of Europe. The funds were used to support a wide range of initiatives, including the reconstruction of infrastructure, the revitalization of industry, and the provision of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The impact of the Marshall Plan was immediate and profound. Industries that had once been on the brink of collapse were now thriving, and standards of living began to rise across the continent. The streets that had once been filled with rubble were now bustling with activity, as shops reopened, Factories resumed production and people went about their daily lives with a newfound sense of hope and optimism. In the years that followed, Europe began to emerge from the shadows of war and destruction. With the support of the Marshall Plan, industries were rebuilt, infrastructure was restored, and economies began to grow once more. The streets that had once been filled with rubble were now bustling with activity. As shops reopened, factories resumed production, and people went about their daily lives with a newfound sense of hope and purpose. But the road to recovery was not without its challenges. The scars of war ran deep, and the process of rebuilding was often slow and difficult. In many cases, entire industries had to be rebuilt from the ground up, and the process of clearing away the rubble and debris left by years of conflict was a daunting task. Moreover, political tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to undermine the fragile peace that had been established in the aftermath of the war. But despite the obstacles, the people of Europe pressed on, determined to build a better future for themselves and their children. They worked tirelessly to rebuild their shattered economies, and their efforts were rewarded with a newfound sense of prosperity and stability. The Marshall Plan had provided them with the resources they needed to rebuild their lives, and they were determined to make the most of it. In the years that followed, Europe experienced a period of unprecedented growth and prosperity. Industries that had once been on the brink of collapse were now thriving, and standards of living began to rise across the continent. The scars of war began to fade as Europe rebuilt itself, brick by brick, into a stronger, more resilient continent. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Marshall Plan was the spirit of cooperation and solidarity that it fostered among the nations of Europe. In the years following the war, old rivalries and animosities were set aside as countries came together to work towards a common goal. Borders were opened, trade barriers were removed, and people moved freely across the continent in search of opportunity and a better life. The creation of the European Recovery Program laid the groundwork for the creation of the European Union, a political and economic union that would bring together the nations of Europe in a spirit of cooperation and solidarity. The EU would serve as a powerful symbol of the potential for unity in the face of adversity, and it would play a crucial role in shaping the future of the continent in the decades to come. By the early 1950s, the benefits of the Marshall Plan were becoming increasingly apparent. The economies of Europe were experiencing unprecedented levels of growth, fueled by the infusion of capital provided by the United States. Industries that had once been on the brink of collapse were now thriving, and standards of living were rising across the continent. The success of the Marshall Plan extended far beyond the borders of Europe. By helping to rebuild the economies of Western Europe, the United States had succeeded in preventing the spread of communism and securing a more stable and prosperous world for future generations. The plan served as a powerful example of the potential for international cooperation to address the most pressing challenges facing the world today. The impact of the Marshall Plan extended far beyond the borders of Europe, shaping the course of history and serving as a powerful example of the potential for international cooperation to address the most pressing challenges facing the world today. It stood as a testament to the power of generosity and compassion in helping those in need and fostering a more peaceful and prosperous world for all. As Europe rebuilt itself in the years following the war, it became a beacon of hope for people around the world. The success of the Marshall Plan showed that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of hope, and that by working together we can overcome even the greatest of challenges. The impact of the Marshall Plan extends far beyond the borders of Europe, shaping the course of history and serving as a powerful example of the potential for international cooperation to address the most pressing challenges facing the world today. It stands as a testament to the power of generosity and compassion in helping those in need and fostering a more peaceful and prosperous world for all. As we look to the future, let us remember the lessons of the Marshall Plan and work together to build a better world for future generations. By embracing the spirit of cooperation and solidarity that defined the Marshall Plan, we can overcome even the greatest of challenges and build a brighter future for all.